Welcome to my channel. Please like this video and subscribe. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's get started. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the well-maintained lawn of Grant Holloway's suburban house in Austin. Grant pulled into his driveway, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. He glanced at the clock, 5:30 p.m. It was earlier than usual, but not early enough to raise suspicion. As he stepped out of the car, the day's stress seemed to lift from his shoulders. This quiet neighborhood was his safe haven. He surveyed the two-story home, feeling a surge of pride. Every brick and flower reflected years of hard work. Grant made his way up the path, briefcase in hand. Just as he was about to grab the doorknob, a muffled voice stopped him in his tracks. Janelle's voice, hushed but clear, was speaking from inside. Odd, she rarely spoke in that tone, controlled and almost cold. "Once he's done paying for your private school, I'm filing for divorce," she said. Grant froze, his hand hovering just above the door. Surely he had misheard, but Janelle kept talking, every word hitting him like a dagger. "I'll accuse him of abuse, destroy his reputation, and we'll live off his money with your real father, Owen. He won't see it coming." The world seemed to tilt as Grant's vision blurred and his breath caught. Real father? Owen? Those names swirled in his head like a storm of betrayal and disbelief. Then he heard his daughter Mara's voice, his 17-year-old daughter, or so he had thought. She sounded rehearsed, almost uninterested. "And then we'll make sure he never bothers us again, right?" Grant stumbled back, nearly tripping over the welcome mat. The irony wasn't lost on him. Welcome indeed. He gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white as he tried to process what he had just overheard. Memories flashed through his mind: late nights at the office, weekends sacrificed all to provide for his family and to give Mara the opportunities he had never had. The private school tuition that strained their finances now twisted painfully in his gut. His little girl, the thought, was like a knife. His mind raced, piecing together countless small moments that suddenly made horrible sense: Janelle's increased absences, her vague excuses, the growing distance between them. He had chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of marriage, never imagining the deep rot beneath the surface. And Mara, his sweet, ambitious daughter, who had always seemed like his pride and joy, how long had she known? How long had she been a part of this deceit? The urge to burst through the door to confront them was overwhelming, but years of disciplined thinking, of carefully weighing every move, held him back. They couldn't know he had figured it out, not yet. With trembling hands, Grant quietly unlocked the door. He took a deep breath, forced his expression into one of calm, and stepped inside. "I'm home," he called out, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Janelle appeared in the hallway, her face all smiles and warmth. "Hey, honey. You're early today," she greeted. Grant studied her, searching for any sign of the coldness he had just heard. There was none. She looked every bit the loving wife, so flawless in her act it made his stomach turn. "Yeah," he replied, the lie slipping easily from his lips. "I finished the Johnson project ahead of time." "Where's Mara?" "Oh, she's upstairs, studying. You know how focused she gets before exams," Janelle said with a smile. Grant nodded, forcing a smile in return. "That's my girl, always working hard," he replied, resisting the urge to expose her lie right then and there. Janelle came closer, placing her hand on his arm. "You must be tired. Why don't you relax while I finish up dinner?" "Sounds great," Grant managed, suppressing the impulse to pull away from her touch. "I'll just freshen up." As he climbed the stairs, each step felt heavy. He paused outside Mara's room, his hand raised to knock. What would he find if he opened that door? His diligent daughter, hard at work, or a stranger plotting his demise? In the end, he couldn't do it. The facade had to stay in place for now. Grant retreated to the master bedroom and locked the door behind him. Only then did he allow himself to break down. He sank onto the bed, his head in his hands as silent sobs shook his body. Everything he had believed in, everything he had worked for, was built on lies. But as the initial shock began to fade, another emotion took its place: anger. Cold, calculated anger that pushed the pain aside and sharpened his focus. Grant stood, wiping his eyes. He wasn't going to be their victim. He wouldn't let them destroy everything he had built. No, he would beat them at their own game. With renewed determination, he booted up his laptop. His first task was to protect his assets. He accessed their joint accounts and moved the funds into a new account in his name. This wasn't about the money, it was about preventing them from using it against him. Next, he pulled up Mara's school records. His jaw tightened as he looked at the tuition costs, each payment a bitter reminder of misplaced trust. With a few clicks, he cancelled all future payments. Let them figure out how to explain that. As he worked, his mind raced ahead, formulating plan after plan. He needed evidence, solid proof of their betrayal, and he had to learn more about Owen, the man behind it all. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Grant Janelle called. "Dinner's ready, honey." Grant closed his laptop and took a deep breath. "Be right there," he answered, amazed at how steady his voice sounded. Dinner was a test of his self-control. He watched Janelle and Mara closely, searching for any slip-ups. They chatted about school and weekend plans as if they hadn't been plotting his downfall hours earlier. "So, Mara," Grant asked casually, "how are those college applications coming along?" Mara's face lit up, her smile so genuine it made Grant almost doubt what he had heard. "Almost. Great, Dad. I'm really hoping to get into UEAT Austin's engineering program. Following in your footsteps, you know." The words, once a source of pride, now felt like acid in Grant's ears. He forced a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You know I'll always support your dreams." Janelle reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're so lucky to have you, Grant, aren't we, Mara?" she said. Mara nodded enthusiastically. "The best dad ever," she said. Grant swallowed the bile rising in his throat but kept his composure. "I'm the lucky one," he replied, the lie bitter on his tongue. As the days went by, Grant threw himself into his covert mission with the same intensity he had once devoted to his family. He installed hidden cameras throughout the house, tracking Janelle's every move. He hired an IT specialist to recover deleted texts and emails from her phone. Every new piece of evidence was another painful blow, further proof of their deep betrayal. He also uncovered details about Owen, a financial consultant known for his charm but with a history of shady ventures and angry investors. One evening, about a week after overhearing that fateful conversation, Grant found himself alone in the house. Janelle was supposedly at her book club meeting, something Grant now saw through, and Mara was off at a study group. He sat in his home office, surrounded by printed papers and digital evidence of their betrayal texts between Janelle and Owen, filled with passionate words and mocking comments aimed at Grant, unexplained withdrawals on their bank statements, and a paternity test he had secretly conducted. Confirming his worst fears about Mara, the pain in his chest was constant, but it was now overshadowed by a grim resolve. He refused to be their victim. He wouldn't allow them to tear down the life he had worked so tirelessly to build. Grant's phone buzzed, revealing a message from Janelle running late. "Don't wait up," he stared at the text, noting the casual heart emoji at the end, thrown in as an afterthought. How many times had he received texts like these without ever guessing what was really going on? In that moment, Grant made up his mind. He couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by lies, pretending to be the clueless husband and father. It was time to disappear. Working quickly, Grant packed a bag with essentials, clothes, toiletries, important documents. He transferred more money to his private account, leaving just enough in the joint account to avoid suspicion. As he moved through the house, gathering his belongings, his gaze fell upon the family photos hanging on the walls, smiling faces from happier times, or so he had once believed. Now every image felt like a mockery. He paused in front of a recent photo of Mara at her school science fair, beaming proudly as she displayed her first-place ribbon. Despite everything, part of him still loved her, still saw her as his little girl. But he couldn't allow that love to blind him anymore. Mara had made her decision. She was no victim. She was a participant. Grant took the photo out of its frame and tucked it into his bag, a reminder of what he had lost and why he couldn't afford to look back. Finally, he sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a brief note. "Janelle and Mara, I know the truth, all of it. I will not be a pawn in your game anymore. Don't try to find me, don't try to contact me. It's over. Grant." He left the note on the table, where they couldn't miss it, and with one last glance at the home that had once been his sanctuary, Grant Holloway walked out into the night. As he drove away, watching the house shrink in his rearview mirror, a wave of emotions washed over him: grief for the life he was leaving behind, anger at the betrayal that had pushed him to this point, but also a feeling of freedom. For the first time in years, his future was his own. Grant tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he merged onto the highway, He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but one thing was certain: this wasn't the end of his story, only the beginning. Janelle and Mara thought they had won. They believed they could use him and then discard him when it suited them, but they had underestimated him. Grant allowed himself a grim smile as he accelerated, leaving Austin and his old life behind. They wanted to ruin him, fine, but he would be the one to shape his own fate, and when the time was right, when he had rebuilt himself into something stronger and more formidable than they ever imagined, he would return. Then they would understand the true meaning of revenge. The skyline of San Antonio loomed ahead as Grant navigated through the morning traffic. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when he had walked away from his old life, but the memory still felt fresh. He had traded the familiar streets of Austin for this new urban setting, determined to start over. Grant pulled into the parking lot of Horizon Engineering, the firm he now considered his second home. As he stepped out of his car, he straightened his tie and took a deep breath. Today was an important day, a meeting with potential investors that could take the company to the next level. Morning, Mr. Holloway called Sarah, his assistant, as he walked through the office. Your 9AA is already waiting in the conference room. Grant nodded, his face calm and composed. Thanks, Sarah. Any messages? Just one, she replied, handing him a note. A woman called, wouldn't leave her name. She said it was urgent. For a split second, Grant's mask of composure slipped. Could it be Janelle? Or worse, Mara? He crumpled the note in his hand, dismissing the thought. Probably just another sales call, he said, his voice steady. I'll deal with it later. The conference room went quiet as Grant entered. 6 pairs of eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity and expectation. He recognized most of them local business leaders and potential investors, but one face stood out: a man he didn't know, sharp-eyed and wearing an expensive suit. Gentlemen, Grant began, his voice confident and clear. Thank you for coming. Before we start, I don't believe we've met, he gestured to the stranger. The man stood and extended his hand. Marcus Reeves, Venture Capital Associates. I hope you don't mind me joining in, Mr. Holloway. Your reputation precedes you. Grant shook his hand firmly, studying Reeves closely. There was something familiar about him, but he couldn't quite place it. Not at all, Mr. Reeves, Grant replied smoothly. The more, the merrier. For the next hour, Grant outlined his vision for Horizon Engineering's future, speaking passionately about innovative designs and pushing the limits of structural engineering. He saw the investors leaning forward, their interest growing with each word. And that, gentlemen, Grant concluded, is why Horizon is positioned to revolutionize the industry. Any questions? The room buzzed with conversation as Grant answered questions with confidence. But through it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reeves was watching him too intently. As the meeting wrapped up, Reeves approached Grant. Impressive presentation, Mr. Holloway. I'd love to discuss it further, maybe over dinner. Grant hesitated. Something about Reeves made him uneasy, but turning down a potential investor wasn't an option. Of course, he replied. My assistant can arrange it. That evening, Grant sat across from Reeves in an upscale restaurant. Their conversation flowed easily, covering business strategies and market trends, but as their meals arrived, Reeves leaned in, his voice lowering. You know, Grant, may I call you Grant? I did a bit of digging into your background. Grant's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his eyes fixed on Reeves. Is that so? Reeves nodded, sipping his wine. Quite the story. Successful engineer in Austin, picture-perfect family, then poof, you vanish, only to reappear here in San Antonio. I fail to see how my personal life is relevant to this business discussion, Grant replied, his voice calm but his guard up. Grant responded, his voice steady. I see. Oh, but it does matter, Reeves countered. I like to know who I'm dealing with, and someone who can reinvent himself as thoroughly as you, that's a person worth knowing. Grant's mind raced, trying to figure out how much Reeves actually knew, and more importantly, what he wanted. Mr. Reeves, if you have something to say, I suggest you say it. Reeves leaned back, a small smirk tugging at his lips. My point, Grant, is that I'm not just interested in investing in your company. I'm interested in investing in you. Me, Grant raised an eyebrow. Yes, you. A man with your background could be quite valuable in certain circles involving people who, let's say, need a fresh start. It dawned on Grant. You're talking about something illegal. Reeves shrugged. Illegal? Unethical? Those are such subjective terms. I prefer to see it as offering opportunities to those who need them most. Grant abruptly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not interested, Mr. Reeves, and if that's the kind of investment you're talking about, I suggest you look elsewhere. As he turned to leave, Reeves called after him. Think about it, Grant. A man like you, with your particular talents, could go far. Grant didn't respond. He walked out of the restaurant, his mind reeling. He had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let someone like Reeves pull him into something dirty. Back at his apartment, Grant poured himself a stiff drink. The meeting with Reeves had unsettled him more than he liked to admit. It served as a reminder that no matter how far he'd come, his past was never too far behind. He walked to the window, staring out into the San Antonio night. In his reflection, he saw not just his current self, but the hardened, colder man he had become. He was successful, yes, but at what cost? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Grant tensed. He wasn't expecting anyone, and after the day he'd had, unexpected visitors were the last thing he needed. Cautiously, he approached the door and looked through the peephole. His heart almost stopped. Standing on the other side was Mara, older now, but unmistakably her. For a long moment Grant stood frozen, his hand on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, pretend he wasn't home. But a deeper, long-buried part of him pushed him forward. He opened the door. Mara's eyes widened. Dad, she breathed, the word hanging between them like a vast chasm. Grant's expression remained unreadable. Mara, how did you find me? She shifted awkwardly. It wasn't easy. I've been searching for years. Can I come in? Against his better judgment, Grant stepped aside, allowing her in. He watched as her eyes scanned the apartment, simple, functional, with no personal touches. Nice place, Mara said, attempting casual conversation, but it fell flat. What do you want? Mara. Grant's voice was cold, controlled. She turned to him, her eyes welling up with tears. I need your help, Dad. Mom's in trouble. We both are. Grant let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. Of course you're in trouble. So now you run to dear old Dad. Did you think I'd forget everything? That I'd welcome you with open arms? No, Mara faltered. I know what we did was wrong, but you don't understand. Mom, she's... Stop. Grant's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. I don't want to hear it. Whatever mess you and your mother are in, it's not my problem. Mara's face crumbled. Please, Dad. I know we hurt you, but I was just a kid. I didn't know any better. A kid. Grant's calm exterior cracked, anger creeping into his tone. You were 17, Mara, old enough to know right from wrong. Old enough to be an accomplice in wrecking my life. That's not fair, Mara shot back, her own temper flaring. You have no idea what it was like after you left. Mom fell apart. Owen turned out to be a fraud. We lost everything. And whose fault is that? Grant snapped, his eyes narrowing. You and your mother made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. Mara stared at him, stunned and hurt. I can't believe this. You're not the man I remember. You're right, Grant said, his voice low and dangerous. That man died the night he overheard his wife and daughter plotting to destroy him. A heavy silence fell between them. Mara's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving her. So that's it? You won't help us? Grant walked to the door and opened it. I think you should leave. Mara moved slowly to the doorway, pausing for a moment. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'm sorry for everything. For a brief second, Grant's resolve wavered. The raw emotion in Mara's eyes tugged at something deep inside him. But then he remembered the conversation he had overheard, the years of lies, the life he had been forced to abandon. Goodbye, Mara, he said, closing the door firmly. Alone once more, Grant leaned against the door, his heart pounding. He had done it, he had stood his ground, so why did he feel so empty? The next few weeks blurred together. Grant threw himself into his work with renewed focus, as though sheer determination could help him outrun the ghosts of his past. But Mara's visit had stirred up memories and emotions he had tried for years to bury. One afternoon, as Grant was studying blueprints in his office, Sarah knocked on the door. Mr. Holloway, there's a Detective Rodriguez here to see you. Grant's head snapped up. A detective? Show him in. A moment later, A tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit entered the room. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Detective Rodriguez with the San Antonio PD. I'm afraid I have some bad news." Grant's heart raced. Had something happened to Mara? To Janelle? Despite everything, the thought filled him with dread. "What is it, Detective?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Rodriguez sighed. "It's about your ex-wife, Janelle Holloway. I'm sorry to inform you that she was found dead in her Austin apartment this morning." The world tilted beneath Grant. He gripped the edge of his desk for support. Dead? How? "Initial reports suggest an overdose, but we're treating it as suspicious. Mr. Holloway, when was the last time you had any contact with your ex-wife?" Grant's mind spun. Should he mention Mara's visit? "No, that would only complicate things. Not since I left Austin 5 years ago," he replied. "We didn't part on good terms." Rodriguez nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "And your daughter Mara? Have you spoken to her?" Grant hesitated. No, he lied, the word bitter on his tongue. "Not for years." The detective studied him for a moment. "I see. Well, Mr. Holloway, if you think of anything that might help with our investigation, please don't hesitate to reach out." He handed Grant his card. After Rodriguez left, Grant sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. Janelle was gone. The woman he had once loved, the one who had betrayed him so completely, was dead. Shouldn't he feel something? Anger? Grief? Relief? But all he felt was emptiness. As the day dragged on, Grant found it impossible to focus. The blueprints in front of him blurred into senseless lines. Finally, as the office emptied for the night, he made a decision. "Sarah," he called to his assistant, "cancel my meetings for the next few days. Something's come up." The drive to Austin was long and quiet, filled with memories. The good times with Janelle, before it had all fallen apart. The life they had built. The family he had thought he had. As he crossed into the city limits, an unsettling feeling settled in his chest. What had once been home now felt foreign and hostile. Grant checked into a hotel, making sure to avoid the old neighborhood. He wasn't ready to confront those memories just yet. Instead, he found himself heading to the police station. Detective Rodriguez looked up in surprise as Grant stepped into his office. "Mr. Holloway, I wasn't expecting you," he said. Grant sank heavily into the chair opposite him. "I need to know what happened to Janelle." Rodriguez sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Holloway, I understand this is hard, but I can't discuss an ongoing investigation." "Please," Grant urged. "I know we were estranged, but we were married for 20 years. I need to understand." The detective studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but this stays between us." "Got it." At Grant's nod, he continued, "It wasn't an overdose. Janelle was murdered. They tried to make it look like an OD, but there were signs of a struggle." Grant felt the blood drain from his face. "Murdered? By who?" "We're still investigating," Rodriguez said, hesitating, "but we can't find your daughter, Mara. She's not a suspect, but we need to talk to her. Are you sure you haven't heard from her?" The lie came more easily this time. "No, none." As Grant left the station, his mind was reeling. Janelle was murdered, and Mara was missing. What had they gotten themselves involved in? Without realizing it, he found himself driving aimlessly. He ended up back in his old neighborhood. The house stood before him, dark and silent. Grant parked across the street, staring at the home that had once been his. The lawn was unkempt, the paint peeling. It looked abandoned. Then movement in an upstairs window caught his eye, a shadow slipping away quickly. Grant's heart raced. Could it be? Before he could think twice, he was out of the car and crossing the street. He tried the front door, locked. But he remembered the loose board on the back porch where they used to hide a spare key. It was still there. Grant let himself in quietly, every step bringing a flood of memories. The living room where he'd overheard that life-shattering conversation, the kitchen where they'd shared countless meals as a family. A creak from upstairs froze him in place. Someone was definitely here. Grant ascended the stairs slowly, his heart pounding. The sound had come from Mara's old room. He cautiously pushed the door open. There, huddled in the corner, was Mara. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. "Dad," she whispered. Grant stood in the doorway, a whirlwind of emotions battling within him: anger, her betrayal, worry for her obvious distress, and deep down a stubborn love he couldn't quite extinguish. Mara, he rasped, his voice rough. What have you done? The tension in the room was palpable. Grant stood frozen in the doorway, his face unreadable, while Mara crouched in the corner, fear and desperation etched into her features. Dad, please, she whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't kill Mom. You have to believe me. Grant clenched his jaw. Then explain, he demanded. Explain why your mother is dead, and you're hiding out in this abandoned house. Mara took a shaky breath. It was Owen. He got mixed up with dangerous people, loan sharks, I think. When he couldn't pay them back, they came after us. And your mother, Grant pressed, his voice hard. Tears streamed down Mara's face. She tried to protect me, told me to run while she dealt with him. I was scared, so I ran. Grant's fists tightened at his sides. You left her to die. No, Mara cried. I didn't know they would. She always managed to handle things before her words hung in the air, heavy with guilt and regret. Grant's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the life he'd left behind. How long has this been going on, Mara, he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Mara's shoulders slumped. Years. Ever since you left. Owen wasn't the man Mum thought he was. He used us, but she was too proud to admit it, too afraid to leave. Familiar anger bubbled up in Grant's chest. And you, he asked, were you too scared to tell the truth, to ask for help? I tried, Mara shot back, a spark of defiance lighting up her eyes. I came to you, remember? But you turned me away. The accusation stung, but Grant didn't let it show. You came for money, not help. There's a difference. A heavy silence fell between them. Grant glanced around the room, taking in the faded posters, the dusty trophies, reminders of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Finally, he spoke. We need to go to the police. You have to tell them what you know about Owen and the people after him. Mara's eyes widened in fear. No, Dad, you don't understand. These people are dangerous. If they find out I talked. They're going to find you anyway, Grant cut in. At least this way you'll have protection. Mara shook her head violently. I can't. I won't. Grant's patience, already wearing thin, snapped. Damn it, Mara, he shouted. Your mother is dead. You're a suspect in her murder. This isn't some game. You think I don't know that? Mara screamed back, tears streaming down her face. You think I wanted any of this? I just wanted I wanted. What? Grant demanded. What did you want? I wanted my dad back. The words burst out of her, raw and painful. I wanted the man who used to tuck me in at night, who taught me to ride a bike, who made me feel safe. Where did he go, Dad? Where did you go? The accusation hit Grant like a punch to the gut. For a moment he saw not the young woman before him, but the little girl he had once cherished, the little girl he had abandoned. But the moment passed and reality came crashing back. Grant's expression hardened. That man died the night he found out his family betrayed him, he said coldly. You made your choice, Mara. Now you have to live with the consequences. Mara's face crumpled. So that's it? You're just going to turn me in? Grant moved toward the door. I'm going to do what I should have done 5 years ago. I'm going to make this right. As he reached for his phone to call Detective Rodriguez, a noise from downstairs made them both freeze. Hello, a male voice called up. Mara! Are you here? Mara's face went white. Oh God, she whispered. It's Owen! Grant's mind raced. Owen, the man who had helped destroy his family, who had apparently gotten Janelle killed. A cold fury settled over him. Stay here, he ordered Mara. Don't make a sound. Before she could argue, Grant slipped out of the room and descended the stairs. In the dim light of the living room, Owen stood older and more worn down than Grant remembered, but unmistakably him. Owen turned at the sound of Grant's approach, his eyes widening in shock. Grant? What the hell are you doing here? Grant's voice was ice. I could ask you the same thing, Owen. Come to finish what you started. Owen's surprise quickly shifted to a nervous chuckle. Come on, Grant, that's all in the past, right? Water under the bridge. I'm just looking for Mara. Have you seen her? Cut the act, Grant snarled. I know what you've done. Janelle is dead because of you. Owen's confident facade cracked. That wasn't my fault. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just needed more time, more money. More lies, Grant interrupted. That's all you've ever done, isn't it? Using people, throwing them away when they're no longer useful. Owen's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. Look, Grant, we can work this out. I've got a plan. With your help, we could. No, Grant cut him off, his voice firm as steel. No more plans. No more schemes. This ends here. Owen's desperation turned to anger. You self-righteous bastard, he spat. You think you're better than me. At least I stayed. At least I tried to take care of them after you ran off. Grant's control snapped. With a roar of rage, he lunged at Owen. They crashed into the coffee table, sending old magazines and debris flying. Grant's fist connected with Owen's jaw. Years of pent-up rage fueled the punch. Owen fought back, scratching and kicking as they wrestled across the floor, knocking over lamps and overturning furniture. What was once a home filled with joy now echoed with the sounds of their violent struggle. Amid the chaos, neither man noticed Mara coming down the stairs. She froze, watching the two men who had shaped her life locked in a brutal fight. Stop, she screamed, her voice piercing the room. Both of you stop. Her shout startled them. Grant loosened his grip on Owen's collar, just enough for Owen to push him off and make a dash for the door. Grant started to go after him, but Mara's voice stopped him. Dad, please let him go. Grant turned to her, his chest heaving. Mara, he's responsible for your mother's death. He has to pay for it. Mara's eyes were filled with sadness but firm resolve. He will, but not like this. Not with more violence. For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other, then Grant slowly nodded. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Rodriguez. It's Grant Holloway. I think I have some information you'll want to hear. The next few hours were a blur as police swarmed the house, taking statements and gathering evidence. Grant watched as Mara was handcuffed and led away, her eyes meeting his one last time before she was placed in a squad car. When the commotion finally died down, Detective Rodriguez approached him. Mr. Holloway, I have to say, this is quite the story. Are you sure you had no prior knowledge of any of this? Grant met his gaze without flinching. None. I left that life behind years ago. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. Well, your daughter's testimony should be enough to bring in Owen and his associates. As for her involvement, that'll be for the courts to decide. Grant felt a heavy burden settle on his shoulders. What happens next? Now, Rodriguez said with a sigh, we start building the case. It's going to be a long process, Mr. Holloway. I hope you're ready for that. Grant looked around at the house, the life he had built and left behind. It all felt like a distant memory now. Ready or not, detective, I'll do whatever it takes to see justice served. As the sun rose over Austin, Grant stood on the porch of his old house. The police had finally cleared out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Sarah, it's Grant. I need you to cancel my meetings for the next few weeks. Something's come up. No, everything's not okay, but it will be. Ending the call, Grant took a deep breath. A long road lay ahead, trials, testimonies, confronting the ghosts of his past. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He wouldn't let Janelle's death be for nothing. He wouldn't abandon Mara, no matter how much she had hurt him. And he would make sure that Owen and his partners paid for what they had done. As he walked to his car, Grant's resolve solidified. He wasn't the man he used to be, the naive husband and doting father. Life had reshaped him into something tougher, colder. But perhaps, just maybe, there was still room for growth, for change. He wouldn't forgive, and he couldn't forget, but he could fight. Fight for justice, for closure, for a future free of betrayal's weight. Grant Holloway started his car, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The past was behind him, but the future was his to shape. Epilogue 1 year later. Grant stood at a podium, cameras flashing around him. Behind him stood the newly opened Grant Holloway Foundation for Victims of Financial Fraud, a shining example of his determination to turn his family's tragedy into something positive. Today he began, his voice strong and steady. We take a stand against those who prey on the vulnerable, those who use deception and manipulation to ruin lives. In the crowd, he spotted familiar faces, Detective Rodriguez nodding in approval, Sarah, his loyal assistant, beaming with pride, and in the back, escorted by a prison guard, was Mara. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. This foundation, Grant continued. is dedicated to supporting those who have been victims of financial predators. We will provide them with resources, guidance, and a way forward when they feel they have nowhere else to turn." As he spoke, Grant felt a burden lift from his shoulders. He would never forget the pain of betrayal, the years of anger and bitterness, but he had found a way to channel that pain into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the fate that had befallen his family. "To those who think they can exploit others without consequence," he concluded, his voice filled with conviction, "know this: we are watching, we are fighting, and we will not stop until justice is served." The applause was overwhelming as Grant stepped down from the podium. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had survived the storm and emerged stronger, more focused. The man who had fled Austin in the dead of night, broken and betrayed, was gone. In his place stood Grant Holloway, a man shaped by adversity, tempered by pain, and driven by an unshakable commitment to justice. He would never forget and could never fully forgive, but he was moving forward, step by step, writing a new chapter in a life that once seemed shattered beyond repair. The future stretched before him, uncertain yet full of promise, and for the first time in years Grant was ready to meet it head-on.